The dream and those that fought for the dream. Fought for everybody. Whether we agree or disagree politically, we all were the recipients of the dream and must move it forward. Recently, I went and talked with Condoleeza Rice, former Secretary of State. We don't agree on much, but we found out we had a lot in common. We were born about a month apart, and we talked about things that she and I certainly had never talked before, and I never heard us say a lot of this before. Condoleeza Rice and I. The world knows you as Condoleeza Rice, former Secretary of State, first black woman to be a national security advisor. But you were born and raised in Alabama, in Birmingham, and you grew up in a segregated South. Tell us about how it was growing up in Birmingham.
Well, growing up in Birmingham, which was clearly the most segregated big city in America, and a place that in 1962 and 63 would be called Bombingham because it was so violent. You'll remember that. It was like living in a parallel world. You were always aware that you couldn't go to a movie theater, couldn't go to a restaurant. I've said sometimes, very often, that my parents couldn't take me to have a hamburger at the Woolworth's lunch counter, but they had me absolutely convinced I could be president of the United States if I wanted to be.
You know, I was fascinated when I read you telling the story about how your father became a Republican. Yeah. With all of the politics I thought I knew, I never knew that story.
In 1952, he went down to register to vote in Birmingham. He was a young minister, high school athletic director, and they said to him, he went down with my mother, who he was dating. They weren't yet married. And my mom, beautiful woman, and the poll tester, you'll remember poll testers, said to her, so what do you teach? She said, American history. Actually, she taught English. He said, so you probably know who the first president of the United States was. She said, yes, George Washington. He said, you pass. Then my father, big, tall, dark-skinned man, rather imposing, the poll tester said to him, pointing to a jar about this high, how many beans are in this jar?
Wow.
Now, when my dad couldn't answer, of course, he failed the poll test. So he was very despondent about this, was around his church. This elder of his, a man who named Frank Hunter, said, Reverend, don't you worry about it. I'm going to tell you how you get registered to vote. He said, we're going to go back down there. He said, now there's a clerk down there, and she's actually a Republican. And if you'll just say you're a Republican, she'll register you because she wants to get as many Republicans as she can. And so he went down, he said he was a Republican, she registered him, and he stayed true to his word, and he was a Republican the rest of his life.
But a lot of people don't know that that generation, and we're in the same generation, our parents were all, my mother and father were Republicans. I think they changed Democrat with Kennedy and Johnson. And that was the norm.
It was the norm because the Democratic Party in the South
were the
Dixiecrats.
Now, you're in Birmingham, civil rights movement, volatile in Birmingham. You actually knew some of the 4 girls that were bombed at 16th Street Baptist Church?
I knew Denise McNair very well. Denise's family was in our neighborhood. Her dad was the photographer at everybody's birthday party and everybody's wedding. And I will never forget that awful day in September when 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed. Somebody called the church to say that a bomb had gone off at 16th Street. We felt the explosion.
Oh, really?
My
at
dad's,
your church?
Right. My dad's church was only about 2 miles from 16th Street Baptist Church, and so it was like the ground shook. And I remember pretty soon we were starting to hear that these little girls had been killed, and then the names started to come out, and of course everybody knew one of those little girls. And for kids in Birmingham of my age, I was 8, it was, how could these people hate us so much? What is this?
Well, your dad actually had a watchman group on the block.
My father and his friends formed a brigade to keep the community safe. They had their shifts with their weapons out there to keep night riders out of the community. Now, I don't think they ever actually shot at anybody, but they shot their guns in the air once in a while. But that was how they protect. Because the police couldn't protect you. Coming home one day from my grandparents' house, a bomb. We felt a bomb go off. We heard an explosion. And my father put us back in the car and started to drive away. And my mother said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to go to the police." And she said, "They probably set the bomb. What do you mean you're going to the police?"
Wow.
And we turned around and went back to my grandparents' house.
Now, one of the things that your parents pushed you and encouraged you and gave you a mentality, and one of the most touching things I've heard lately was when you were asked by President Bush to serve in Washington, and you said you wanted to stay and take care of your father.
That's right.
And your father passed, and you always wondered, was that his message for you to go on to Washington?
My dad, who I just loved dearly, and he was not very well from February of 2000 until November, December, and you would note that that was the period of the election, and I was working for George W. Bush,
right.
Organizing his foreign policy. And my dad, I think, kind of waited until Bush v. Gore was decided. He knew in his own rather mental diminished way that I was going to Washington. But I said to President Bush when he called me to say, "I want you to come and be my national security advisor," he said, "I can't do it." I said, "I can't leave my father in this state. He's all I have, and I'm all he has." And he said, "We'll work it out. You can come back every week," or he was trying to work it out. A couple days later, my father died. And I thought to myself, "Daddy, you didn't do that so I could go to Washington,
wow.
did you?" But it would have been just like him.
Once you got out of Alabama, who were there people you looked up to that mentored you or that you used as role models?
All along the way, there were people who advocated for me. This idea that you get there on your own, none of us got there on our own. Somebody was there for us. And so I say to young people, look for those people. And I say to those of us who are old enough to have made it, look back and find somebody to help. And the only other thing I'll say is we love it when our role models look like us. But if I had been waiting for a black female Soviet specialist role model, I'd be still waiting.
You'd still be waiting.
Yeah.
Against the odds of the segregated South, you took no excuses and became this world historic figure. What do you say to young people who are going to watch this?
Well, the first thing is you may not be able to control your circumstances, but you can control your response to your circumstances. Don't see barriers. Just don't see them. But in order not to see barriers, you have got to be well educated. Not everybody is as fortunate as I was to have parents who understood the system and cared. And so somebody's got to advocate for every child out there. I don't care if it's a minister or a teacher or somebody at the Boys and Girls Club. We have a responsibility. The kids have a responsibility to work hard and not see barriers, but we have a responsibility to advocate for those children. What's important to me is that when I am delivered home by my Lord, that there are people who remember me for what I was able to do to bring somebody else along, people whose lives I touched. One of the great things about being a professor is that you have generations of students who come back and say, you may not know what an impact you had on my life. It's all about the people you touched. Nothing else in the final analysis is going to matter very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rose.
Thank you.
That was my interview with former Secretary of State Condoleeza Rice. I'd like to thank her for taking time and being open to speak with me about her coming up and about race. About 3.5 years ago, I was having a cup of coffee with Phil Griffin, and we started talking about doing something on television to show how far we've come as a country with race and then what lays ahead. And I said, I'd like to do something uptown and tape something with some prominent people. He said, no, live. I said, live? He said, big people, think big, think huge. So he said, MSNBC is the place you've got to do it. This was way before Politics Nation. So I'm not sure if tonight was my idea or Phil's idea, but I am sure that we're here, we're thinking big. MSNBC is showing the world where we've come in 50 years and where we're on our way. We'll be right back.